Thank you so much for this introduction. And I want to thank so much for the invitation to come here to Sarajevo and meet this wonderful floor of dedicated people in this very important topic of developing early childhood education. It's my first visit to Sarajevo. I think it is blocked a bit by snow, but well, in my part of the world we are rather used to snow, so I'm not so impressed, but I have heard that you have really had some problems, and you know, I think you have 3 times the snow as we have in Stockholm right now, so I'm impressed. But it's great to be here, and I hope that my presentation will give some contribution to your work. When talking about preschool inclusion, I will make 2 remarks to begin. The first is that preschool, when I use that term, I refer to the whole, all categories of education and care before school start, meaning kindergartens, early child care institutions, and also baby homes. That is the term used in Scandinavia. Preschool covers the whole period from 0 to 6. Our mandatory school starts at 7, but we have 1 year, a preparatory year, starting from the age of 6. That was one remark. The other remark is that I will refer specifically to disability and special educational needs when I'm talking about inclusion. And now, having heard the presentations today, I realize that there are many other aspects of inclusion, from cultural, from class-related, from language-related aspects. I hope that my examples from the disability field will be useful in some way in your discussions. I will start a bit with values and objectives with the inclusion project. I will not go into details here, but just refer to some of the international documents which introduce inclusion and which defines it in different ways. We have the conventions for children's rights and for rights for persons with disabilities, 2 very important documents which both include inclusion as a basic right, not only inclusion in educational systems, but in all aspects of life, concerning health, employment, education, social services. Then we have UNESCO, which has defined and written a lot about inclusion, going back to the Salamanca Declaration from 1994 and in a series of documents. And we have UNICEF, of course, which have some very important qualifications about inclusion, saying that it is about transforming the systems of service to be inclusive of everyone, and where barriers exist, transform the service so it fits the needs of all children. And that is really a very radical and important position, because it means when you perceive barriers, the conclusion is not to take out the child, but to change the service system. Further into definition matters, UNESCO says it is addressing diversity of needs through participation in learning, cultures, and communities. Participation is a very important term when we try to understand inclusion. Participation is the matter of being an active person, an actor on all arenas of social life. And to be successful in inclusive education, it should be done through active participation by children and by families on those places where education takes place. There are some definitions which I have taken from the scientific literature on inclusion. I have taken it for a specific reason. The first one, Thomas Loxley, two British authors, who says that it is a framework within which all children can be valued equally and provided with real opportunities. I think that is a point in your country when it seems that something about 90% of children are excluded from the preschool services. There is two other authors, Klein and Gilkerson from United States, who says, referring to American documents, that it is placement in a program the child might attend if he or she would not have any special needs. So what they are saying is that the existence of disabilities and special needs is not a reason per se for segregation. And the third is another important person in the field of research on inclusion, Michael Goralnik, who says that it is planned participation between children with and without disabilities. And the important word here in italics is planned. It is not only a matter of physically putting children with special needs into the so-called normal institution. You really have to plan very, very thoroughly to make success of that project. That could be addressed to my own country, because we have for a long time thought it was quite enough just to close the institutions and put every child in the same place in the mainstream preschool. That does not result in inclusion in the meaning of participation. On the contrary, you create some kind of inclusive exclusion, or excluding inclusion, if you want that, meaning that the child actually becomes very isolated, a solitary being sitting in one corner in the preschool home, if you don't have that kind of planning that I'm talking about. But the whole value base of inclusion, which is about creating an inclusive society, a society celebrating diversity, defining diversity as the normal condition of society, is that inclusion is not a special education technique. Inclusion is a social project. In the tradition of social contracts from Locke and Rousseau and modernity, now we have come to this position to create society where diversity is the normality. Sorry, this one. Now, inclusion being so value-based means that the specific meaning of inclusion is not easily transported from one context to another, because when an activity is value-based, its concrete operations are dependent on the specific historical and traditional and national and local conditions about it. So you cannot just take a package of inclusive techniques developed in a university in UK or USA or France or anywhere and put it over to another country and say, these are the successful techniques. You have to go back to the basic values in the fields of education, of care, and of social protection, and see what meaning will this project have in this specific context. A way to highlight that is to put the preschool into a wider socio-ecological perspective. And I have chosen to do that with the well-known systems of Uri Bronfenbrenner. I guess many of you are familiar with that system. I have left out two aspects of his system, what he calls the chrono system, about changes over time, and the biosystem, about the biology of the child, and concentrating on the four most social aspects of it. Before going into these different systems, I will just mention one thing, and that is that preschool is not only about early childhood education. It is about early childhood development, it is about early childhood care, and it is about a fourth very important thing. I would call it early childhood being, to be a person in early childhood. So the preschool inclusive system should be active not only in promoting educational possibilities, but promote development, provide care and social protection, and create an environment where the child acts as a social participant among other children. This is the peer relation aspect of inclusive preschools. And this is, when you go into the literature on research on preschool education, this is really the primary concern when you try to improve and meet challenges in the preschool, inclusive preschool. How to create a good participation system in the peer group. Because care and education could, provided you have the resources, be well arranged by the staff, the personnel, the adults. But the peer system is directed by peers. And you don't easily go into that system and direct how to act as a good peer. I will continue with that aspect. Now, in this preschool context, you could find two possible strategies in creating an inclusive preschool. One is the top-down approach, where you start with the macro system, meaning that you have a legislation, that you have constitutional rights for families to choose the educational and the caring system. And this right is something that hopefully will be implemented in a practice. But that is one basic question. Starting in the top-down approach, how can you change or transform the legislation, the constitutional rights, into an existing and functioning practice? Then there's another strategy, which is the bottom-up approach. You could start with developmental work on local preschools with engaged, dedicated people with some extra resources connected to some developmental project, and create a very well-functioning practice in that specific school or that specific group of schools, with that specific children, with that specific differences in that schools. But how do you scale up these experiences? How do you pass these experiences through the other systems into a functioning, resourceful, and well-equipped, generalized system? I will start with commenting on the microsystem. The microsystem is about what happens on the preschool floor. And to understand the possibilities for an inclusive preschool, you have to consider which are the tasks, which are the typical activities in the preschool, which are these activities that should be adapted to a population of diversity. In an institution as a preschool, you have certain specific activities, you have certain roles, you have relations between actors in the preschool, and these together create a culture. We define a culture as a rather stable social system where activities, roles, and relations are produced and reproduced in a rather tacit way, in a silent way. It exists in the walls in the school. So the question is, which are the basic activities and which are the cultures which make up the preschool situation? Well, two basic activities are nurturing and protecting, and this corresponds to the caring culture of the preschool. You are in the preschool for safety and for comfort. Families, parents could leave the child and feel safe about his or her existence there. The second activity is learning and upbringing, and that is the teaching culture of the preschool. You use certain activities like circle time, like excursions, like scientific stations in the school to teach things. And this teaching culture creates a teacher-pupil relation between staff and children. And then you have the third culture, and that is about playing and socializing. And that is the culture of the peer community, the community of same-age children who create their own rules and their own strategies for entry and for participation in the culture. To create a well-functioning, inclusive preschool, something has to happen with the caring culture, with the teaching culture, and with the culture of peer community. These are very different when you look on a mainstream preschool without included children with disabilities, and look into a specialized preschool which gather a certain group of children with disabilities. The caring culture of a mainstream preschool addresses rather uniform needs. Needs are relatively equal among the so-called typical group of typically developing children. And they are provided in everyday routines like meal time, like rest and sleeping time, like hygiene activities and so on. Looking on the specialized preschool, these are the activities with the highest priority. They are addressing individual needs, not uniform needs, and they are often based on very specialized techniques about using aids, about techniques of alternative communication and so on, about specific techniques in providing food and nurture and medical care and so on. The teaching culture in the mainstream is also relatively uniform. You can make a curriculum based on predictions about the general cognitive level in different age steps, and you direct your curriculum according to that. And teaching can be very group-oriented. You can address an average in a way. While teaching in the specialized preschool is related to very individual cognitive prerequisites from, I don't like the word, uneducable, I have it within a citation, but that is actually a concept used in certain contexts. And you have to use and learn to use very individualized techniques to promote teaching and learning. The peer community of the mainstream preschool is a relative autonomous thing. It is arranged by children by themselves. And it is, through 20 years of research, recognized as being of a very high developmental significance. It is a matter of having fun right now, but it's not only that, it is the most contributing factor to development in social, communicative, and cognitive aspects, the socializing and the play with same-aged peers. While in the specialized preschool, the peer community is of a very low priority. Often you don't have very much of peer relations, but you have the social relations are much more of paired adult-child relations. So these are the differences. And when including, presenting the inclusive system, trying to combine these two systems with each other, the task is to think, which are the barriers? How do we do to adapt the routine-based caring system to the very specialized caring systems in an inclusive environment where everyone should have their needs satisfied. And the same with the teaching and the peer community. I will go more into that. One important thing is that, you know, very much of the research done in the field of promoting inclusive education on the preschool level is anchored in developmental psychology. It is the basic discipline. There is another field of early childhood studies, which is called childhood sociology or simply childhood studies. And that field of studies is more interested not in the developmental projects of children, but how are they acting here and now? How are they establishing their own relations to each other, and what is typical of the communities they create together? From that kind of literature, you can find some very interesting differences between caring and teaching cultures on one side and peer cultures on the other side. And the difference is about authority and about the relations. Caring and teaching cultures are based on society's concern for basic needs in the children. They are oriented towards utilities, about caring, security, need satisfaction, about skills oriented towards the future. And it is a matter of vertical relation, adult in the leading, directing position, children in the dependent positions. Membership in these cultures are ascribed by formal authority. Being enrolled in the preschool, you are entitled to have the caring and the teaching activities adapted to you. While the culture of the peer community has quite another outlook. It is not constructed out of social concerns, but it is constructed and shared in children's interaction with other children. The goal orientation of that culture is pleasure-oriented. Play is the basic activity, but not because it has a developmental significance, simply because it's funny. And the peer culture is also autonomous striving. It defends its independence against adult authority. And this could be very well demonstrated when you, as a teacher, tries to enter into a peer relation to, for example, stop marginalization. You will find that there is a special activity called play defense. The children in that group will maybe adapt to what the adult is saying, but they will move the activity away to another place and to another time, maybe 3 minutes later, 3 meters away, and there the peer culture will be reconstructed and the marginalization will continue there. So membership in the peer culture is not ascribed by authority, it's achieved. And you achieve it by showing that your presence is a contribution to the pleasure activity of the group. If you don't have that kind of contribution, you will be not seen by the others. I will go into the marginalization phenomenon in a while. There are a lot written about how to intervening in peer cultures to improve peer relations. I will not go into details here. One important author is Samuel Odom, a United States researcher, and this is a citation from one of his books called Widening the Circle, about creating inclusive preschool classrooms. The problem with most of these techniques is that they are not long-lasting. You could change interactive patterns in a child group, but they will not generalize to other activities, to other times, to other situations, or to other members. They will be very situation specific. There is one exception, and that is for teaching social skills to children within the autism spectrum disorders. But that is more of a teaching culture. It is not a device for entering into the peer culture. I have myself, together with people in my home university, been working with some other ideas about participation, how to promote participation. And we have developed, or we are working with what we call an access activity theory. What we mean is that to really improve social participation in the inclusive classroom is a matter basically of access. The reason not for being accepted by other children is that you have problems to having access to the activity. And we think about what we call an accessibility triangle, meaning that access is not only a matter of physical access, but access also to the social aspects, that is participating in the communication system, and access to the symbolical aspect of activity, that is understanding its meaning. Play is, as we all know, to transform one situation to a symbolical situation. To be contributor and to be participating in play, you must understand something of that symbolical transition. Looking on specific disability groups, you could identify what kind of access problems are combined with, say, sensory disabilities, cognitive disabilities, motor disabilities, social disabilities, and have an idea where are the basic access barriers. And you could concentrate your interventions to reducing those barriers, which is something else than going into the peer group and trying to direct their play. Being successful in that, you could really raise the level of participation with increased attention, increased parallel play, and also increased degrees of cooperative play, and create some kind of activity which is dependent not only on observable interaction, but also on engagement from the child and recognition from the peer group. Recognition from the peer group is really one basic phenomenon to increase social participation in the inclusive preschool. Most of the research and developmental work done is focusing the child with disabilities. And rather few studies are concentrating on the peer group and the kind of ideas they have about including that and that child. You can see that in play, the peer group creates certain categories of roles, which is affording the play situation. And they also categorize people who want to come in. For example, adult versus child. They will not automatically invite an adult person into a role play. Around some 3-4 years of age, they start to distinguish between genders, boys and girls. They will soon distinguish between functioning play and disruptive play. Those who disrupt the process, they will not be invited. And sometimes they also create ideas about disabilities. And it is rather well known that conditions like Down syndrome are not very much perceived as a problem in the ages of 3 and 4 in a peer group. Motor disabilities, they are seen as problems. But later on, it turns around, so cognitive disabilities will be a reason not to include a peer. So what children do in their play is that they create subpopulations of those who belong and those who not belong. And this is something like a spontaneous process going on in peer play. And you must know something about that in order to know how to really create better conditions for participation. So that was some reflections about the microsystem. The mesosystem is about how different microsystems interact with each other. And there is one is about staff competence, perceptions, relations, and the agency for trying out new methods. There is studies which show that an absolute majority of preschool staff are very positive to the values of inclusion. There is one study in US about a random sample of some 200 caregivers. 90% say, well, we absolutely celebrate the values of inclusion. But then, in the same sample, 2/3 say, however, in practicing inclusion, the child with disability is disruptive. And 2/3 in the same sample say, to work with disabilities is a burden for me. Meaning that going from celebration of values to creating practice is something that really needs exchange of experiences, support, and on-site training, and a lot of support, really. I will continue to this. The exosystem is about those structures above the preschool which facilitate or create barriers for the inclusive project. And there are, I think, 4 very important aspects here. One is how the educational legislation, healthcare legislation, social protection legislation are coordinated with each other. Do they, so to say, support? Do they create possibilities for a collaborative, supportive system for the inclusive preschool? A second important is about teacher training, pre-service training, in-service training, on-site training. A third is about the systems which have heavy responsibilities in assessment and in making propositions for placement. In many of the countries with a defectological tradition, there have been very important committees, pedagogical, medical, psychological committees with very important voices in these matters. The question is, how can these specialists, these experts, be used as facilitators instead of barriers for the inclusive system? It's a matter of including the family into the consultation situation. And a fourth very important aspect here is how administrators interpret the phenomenon of inclusion. What we mean with inclusion. Well, the macro system is about legislation and curricula, but also about public opinion, traditional values, and so on. I will just mention one thing about my country. We had a change from a specialized institutionalized system onto a more inclusive system in the late 60s and during the 70s and 80s. One of the main barriers was public opinion. However, with changed legislation in 1968 and with some very important persons, advocates within the mass media field and within the medical field and with the education field, it was simply changed. And after 5 years of time, the whole negative public opinion was completely changed. It is not an unbreakable barrier, but it's a matter of how public opinion is used in policymaking as something that legitimates segregation or something that could be influenced into celebration of diversities. So actually, I think the basic link in combining the top-down and the bottom-up initiatives is looking into the ecosystem and those aspects I mentioned. The coordination of important legislation, the work of specialist teams with key roles in assessment, the pre-service and in-service training of professional groups, and how administrative bodies are interpreting the phenomenon of inclusion. And finally, I will say, referring to some British authors, the authors of the Index of Inclusion, that inclusion is an ongoing struggle. You don't solve it for once. It will be there all the time, and it will present challenges to your values, to your preparation for really change and go into exchange with the other bodies. Thank you.